I like to think that phrasing it as Columbus connected to the New World is a more appropriate way of saying it than Columbus discovered the New World. Because, for one thing, he wasn't the first person to see it. There were countless people already living there. If anything, if anybody discovered the New World, it was the ancestors of those Native Americans who had come over from Asia thousands and thousands of years ago. So, people were already there. Also, can you say that you've discovered something new when you yourself refuse to admit that it's new? Because Columbus kept insisting that he had been to India. Which, everyone else quickly figured out he had not. But regardless, Columbus making landfall on Hispaniola in October 1492 created a permanent connection between the eastern and western hemispheres, between what was, from the perspective of Europeans, the Old World, to the New World. Now, to the native peoples, the Old World was what they'd been living in, right? And when Europeans showed up, everything changed and their world was made new and not necessarily better for them. And that happened through what is known as the Columbian Exchange, which I'm betting is a term that most of you have heard before. It's a term that probably most people in the U.S. have heard before, and you probably know what it is. It's the idea that once Columbus made landfall and this connection was made, then there was this passing back and forth of things between the two hemispheres, the introduction of a lot of new things into the Western Hemisphere, the New World, and at the same time, the introduction of a lot of new things to the Eastern Hemisphere, the Old World. And this is a really good graphic to show that. So from the point of view of the Europeans, new things that were introduced to them that they got from the Americas included things like pumpkins and squash, pineapples, sweet potatoes, avocados, etc. Tobacco, that's a big one. Peanuts, tomatoes, and so forth. Now, it's kind of hard to imagine that before circa 1500, there were no potatoes in Ireland, and there was no tomato sauce in Italy. But that is true. All those things came about because of the Columbian Exchange. By the way, you might wonder, if turkeys are brand new to Europeans, why is there a country called Turkey? Did they name that country Turkey after this new bird they discovered? Well, no, not really. When the Europeans first saw turkeys, they thought they were really big chickens. That's the only way they could describe them. And the country of Turkey was known for having big chickens. So they called them turkey chickens to start off with, and then eventually figured out they're not chickens, and it got shortened to turkey. Things that came over to the Western Hemisphere included the honeybee. There was no honey in the Americas. There were bees, but not honeybees. Coffee beans, peaches and pears. Peaches especially took off really quickly. Sugar cane, different types of livestock. There had been no domesticated livestock in North America. In South America, llamas and alpacas had been domesticated. But in North America, the only domesticated animals were dogs. Pigs, horses. Horses were something new. Although there had been horses millions of years ago, but they had gone extinct in the Americas. One that's not on here is earthworms. And, well, really, there were earthworms on the West Coast already, but there were no earthworms east of the Mississippi until the Europeans showed up and brought them with them on their ships because they used dirt as ballast to weigh the ship down on their way over. And then they would just take that dirt and toss it out, and then you got worms, and they spread pretty quickly. Also, as you can see, a lot of diseases were introduced to the native people by the Europeans, but you don't see a big list of diseases that went back the other direction. Now, some people have tried to claim that syphilis and gonorrhea came back the other direction, but I don't think that's been conclusively proven. Now, here's something to talk about briefly. Corn. So, corn was something that was native to the Americas and was introduced to Europe and the rest of the Eastern Hemisphere. But if you read Old English, you will come across references to corn before they discovered corn. Why is that? And what's the difference between corn and maize? Well, basically just different letters to make up the words. That's the only real difference. Corn is maize, and maize is corn. Maize is corn. It's the same thing. Here's the story behind that. The English word corn, before the English came to the New World, the English word corn meant grain, any kind of grain that you can eat. So wheat and barley and rye and even oats were called corn. And so, they started calling maize a type of corn. And in North America, the corn word kind of stuck. Maize is actually what it tends to be called in European countries. So that's how that happened. And we're actually going to talk a little bit more about the significance of corn here in just a few minutes. Now, if you're familiar with the word Columbian Exchange, it's probably because it was taught to you in elementary school or middle school. The word itself, the expression, has only been around for less than 50 years. It came from a historian named Alfred Crosby. In 1972, he wrote a book called The Columbian Exchange, which biological and cultural consequences of 1492. And that's what popularized this term, the Columbian Exchange. He also wrote a book years later that sort of was a follow-up to the Columbian Exchange called Ecological Imperialism, the Biological Expansion of Europe, 900 to 1900. You have to wonder sometimes where historians get these dates. You like to have a date after something. Sometimes it is kind of open-ended. Now here's a book you may possibly have heard of. It became very famous, and it gets assigned in a lot of different kinds of classes. Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond. Jared Diamond was a physiology professor. This came out in 1997 and won the Pulitzer Prize for nonfiction, and really introduced a lot of the ideas that I'm talking about now, and I'm going to be talking about, to the American public in a readable way. It was not very dense and academic, which is not true of Alfred Crosby's books. So the reason I'm bringing this up, maybe you've heard of this book, Diamond. Most of this stuff was not new and original with him. He got the Pulitzer Prize because he wrote it well. But most of this stuff is based on the works and theories of Alfred Crosby. So, I mentioned disease. All right, disease was a huge, huge issue in this cultural interchange between Europeans and Native American Indians. Because when Europeans showed up, among the many things they brought over were their diseases, which the native people had very little resistance to. Now, is it the case that there had not been any disease at all in the New World, in the Americas? That's not true. But why were the native people so impacted by the Europeans' diseases when it wasn't really true the other way around. Well, let's unpack that expression, ecological imperialism. Now, I have a definition of imperialism. It is, quote, the creation and or maintenance of an unequal economic, cultural, and territorial relationship, usually between states and often in the form of an empire based on domination and subordination. Okay, so that's imperialism, and the Europeans who were showing up in the Americas were there to imperialize. They were here to colonize and imperialize. They were here to create definitely an unequal relationship in which they were dominant. Now, what does that have to do with ecology? Well, essentially what Crosby argued is that when the Europeans showed up, it wasn't just the European people who dominated the native people in the Americas, but all the stuff the Europeans brought over. They brought a bunch of livestock over, and that livestock just kind of ran rampant, ran unchecked, and in many cases either kind of subdued, minimized, or supplanted the animals that were already there. And this has been true of a lot of things, like different types of birds that were brought over by the Europeans that, before you know it, became the most common kinds of birds in certain parts of North America. So animals, plants that came over with the Europeans would frequently dominate, subjugate the local plant life, just like the humans were doing to the humans. And this has continued to be true in both cases. Whenever something new is introduced into an environment suddenly, then it disrupts the whole balance, right? So, kudzu. Farmers were encouraged to grow kudzu in the South as a way to, among other things, prevent erosion, but it just took over. And if you don't believe that or don't know about it, just drive around in the South and you'll see whole areas covered in kudzu, which 100 years ago there was no such thing in the United States. It came from Japan. Sometimes fish get introduced into an ecosystem in North America because someone brought some over and turned them loose into a lake or whatever. And then before you know it, that particular type of fish is colonizing that pond or that lake and taking it over because there are no natural predators to it. It throws everything out of whack. So Crosby's saying it was everything coming over from Europe that was doing that. The people, yes, but also the plants and the animals and the germs, the microbes, which were able to run rampant in the Americas and pretty well transform everything. And transform it did. It is estimated. Well, there are various estimates. It's hard to say for sure because there was no official census of all the native peoples before Europeans got there. But based on records that we do have access to and the reports of the early Europeans as to the numbers of people, it is estimated that in roughly 150 years, by 1650, as many as 80 million Native American people had died of disease introduced by Europeans. And if it is that high, that means that roughly 20% of the world's population died of these new to them diseases. And that caused huge social and physical change. In fact, it has been theorized that some of the climatological changes that occurred from the 16th century onward may have been due to the fact that lots of land in Central and South America, in particular, had always been cleared and farmed by the people who lived there, but that so many people died that cleared land didn't get replanted, and the forest retook it, and so suddenly there's a lot more trees, a whole lot more trees than there were, and that means there's more carbon dioxide. So that's a possibility. Huge changes that we'll talk about later that occurred in populations in the American South that changed the whole way of life of Native people in a short time. Well, that's some big stuff. Alfred Crosby, in Ecological Imperialism, offered a theory as to why that happened the way it did. And if you'll recall, his dating system on that was from the year 900 to the year 1900. And basically what he's saying is that there was an amazing amount of agricultural growth in Europe starting around 900, which there was, because there were some technological advances in farming that were made around that time that enabled more food to be grown. And basically he's saying that the reason Europeans were able to colonize not just the Americas, but so many parts of the world was due, at least in part, to the fact they had more resistance to disease than anyone else in the world, except in some cases perhaps in Asia, that they had a better immune system. And he had a theory as to why that was. And the theory comes down, particularly when it comes to the Americas, to corn versus wheat. So, there was no wheat in the Americas. There was corn, maize. There was no maize outside of the Americas in the old world. It was all relied upon. Wheat was the staple crop for everybody. In the Americas, corn was the staple crop for most tribes, particularly in Central and North America and down into South America, other than perhaps on the coasts and way up in the Arctic tundra. Besides that, corn was the staple crop. And there's a big difference between wheat and corn beyond just, what your taste buds can tell you. Now, wheat was originally cultivated about 10,000 years ago along the Fertile Crescent in Mesopotamia, in what today we call the Middle East. It started there and slowly spread out to first other parts of the Near East, and then from there to other parts of the Old World. So Egyptians, Babylonians, Assyrians, they all grew wheat. And this may be more of a Western Civ type thing to talk about, but the advance of, quote, civilization is often tied to the advance of agriculture. And in this case, the agriculture in question was wheat. And then the bottom picture shows how that making of wheat into bread spread from the Middle East into other areas, into Europe, into Africa, into Central and South Asia. So here's how Crosby explains that as a factor. Wheat can sustain more people by acreage than corn. You can make more food out of, say, 1 acre of wheat than you can 1 acre of corn. And because that's true, you grow a lot of wheat, you're going to be able to sustain a larger population than some other culture that lives on corn. There's more wheat to go around. You can keep more people alive. And because the populations tended to be higher and denser in the Old World, in the Middle East, in Europe, because populations were denser, the average person encountered more people and more different kinds of people than in the much sparser and more thinly populated Americas, and therefore built up more resistance to more things. Resistance to specific things, and also just a general immunological resistance to even new things. So every once in a while you would have something like the Black Death or the Great Plague that would come through and kill thousands and thousands of people, but eventually it would stop killing people, and the ones who didn't die from it built up resistance to it, to that and to all the other things that went around. And that also just helped them with their general resistance. And the people outside of Europe in particular, but especially in the Americas, didn't have that resistance because they never had that dense population. Now, we talked about earlier on the fact that there were empires and even fairly large cities, particularly in Central and South America, but a few in North America. So there were occasions when people gathered together in great numbers. But especially in North America, those cities tended to have a very finite lifespan. Whether you're talking about Cahokia or the city of the Anasazi, last for maybe a few centuries, but then would just kind of die out. And it's probably because there weren't resources enough to support them. Now, Crosby's theories have gotten a lot of criticism. The biggest criticism being that he relies solely on biology and doesn't look at many other pertinent facts like race, so far as ideas of race, not physical race, or at cultural ideas or things like that. And I would agree with that. Those things are perhaps the larger factor. But I think he was onto something there. I think that there is some truth to what he said as being a large factor, at the very least, in the fact that when Europeans came along, even when they didn't mean to, they just killed huge numbers of native people just from the diseases that came with them. And those diseases sometimes spread ahead of them. It was possible for members of a native tribe in the interior of North America who had never seen a European to get these diseases, because people on the coast had seen Europeans and got the diseases, and then they had spread them to their neighbors who spread them to their neighbors. So anyway, that is at least, I think, an idea that most of you probably haven't heard of before or thought of before that really is worth considering. All right, well, let's get back to the actual literal colonizing and imperializing. When Columbus was on his way back to Spain from his first voyage, he was spotted by the Portuguese returning. They knew he had gone out, and he went back and reported to the King and Queen of Spain what he had found, and they claimed all that in the name of Spain, and Portugal got pretty upset because Portugal, the King of Portugal, King John of Portugal, I think John was still king at this time, had gotten permission from the Pope to colonize and trade everything off the west coast of Africa. So anything out there in the Atlantic. Well, I mean, the Spanish made the argument, this isn't right off the coast of Africa. It's a long way. But tell you what, let's go back to the Pope and see what he says now. And there was a new Pope by then. And the new Pope, Alexander VI. Guess where he was from originally? Spain. So guess who he sided with? Spain. And at the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, Pope Alexander VI basically drew this line. It's the line there on the left. And essentially said, okay, everything on the left side of that line can be colonized by Spain, and everything on the right side can be colonized by Portugal. Now, at this time, this is 1494. All they know for sure is out there is these Caribbean islands that Columbus had been to. So they drew the line, which is why when Pedro Cabral in 1500 or so wound up discovering Brazil, they got to claim Brazil. Portugal did, because Brazil is the one part of South America that sticks out over that line. Therefore, all the other countries that got established in South America speak Spanish, but Brazil, they speak Portuguese. Now, of course, they didn't know. They didn't know what's going to be on the other side. Portugal pretty quickly figured out they had gotten the short end of the stick, because other than Brazil, everything else is across the line. However, once Magellan had sailed completely, or his crew, he didn't live through the whole thing, sailed completely around the globe, and now everyone knows exactly how big it is, and certainly that it's round. It's kind of a problem with that line from the Treaty of Tordesillas, because, you know, if the world is a globe like that, technically everything is on the left side of that line. And technically everything is on the right side of that line. So they had to make another line, essentially, 1529, that cut down through Asia. And the result of that was that Spain had permission from the Pope to colonize pretty much all of the Americas except Brazil. And Portugal got Africa. They had some settlement in the Middle East. They wind up in India, and there's still a Portuguese culture remnant in India. I used to have a friend from India who spoke Portuguese, had a Portuguese name, and several islands, the Japanese islands. Portugal was the first European country to make contact with. Now there was one exception here. Once this line was drawn, if either country already had a colony, had already established a colony before the line was drawn that now winds up on the wrong side of the line, they get to keep that. That's why the Spanish got to keep the Philippines, because they had already established that colony, even though it's technically in Portuguese territory. So essentially the Pope divided the world up between the Spanish and the Portuguese. And bear in mind, we're looking at the first treaty of 1494, the second one 1529. All this is before the Protestant Reformation. So all European countries were Catholic countries. And, you know, the Pope says no one but Spain or Portugal is allowed. That means that none of the other countries are going to go against that, at least not at first. Later on they'll start trying to get away, even the Catholic countries, with doing that. So that's why we wind up with this map that we're looking at, with the purple areas colonized by Spain, and the orange by Portugal, or by 1550. Okay. You may want to refer back in a moment to this image to see the different voyages, because I'm going to mention these various voyages, and you can see where they were and who took them. This guy, Amerigo Vespucci, who was an Italian navigator from the city-state of Florence, Italy, was kind of a free agent, as really Columbus had been, in that he undertook voyages first for Spain and then for Portugal to the New World. His voyage for Spain may have been as early as 1497, or it may have been a little bit later in 1499, certainly by 1500. And then his second voyage for Portugal, in which he explored the contours of Brazil, was in 1501. And it was Vespucci who made the assertion, after having sailed down the Brazilian coast for a while, Brazil, unlike all the places Columbus had been so far, was not an island. It was part of a continent, that there was at least one whole other continent out there, and he called it the New World. And news of that got around. For sure, it's not India. But news of that got around, and in 1507, a German cartographer named Martin Waldseemüller, inspired by the journal and the reports of Vespucci, drew a map of this new continent based on what they knew so far. So if you look, he thinks that North and South America are really, really tiny, but that's because that's all they've seen. So he knows they're at least that big, okay? And he decided to call this continent, to name it after Americo, which sometimes is spelled Americo. Depends on how hard you say the G. But since continents and land masses, like ships, were often referred to in the feminine, like for example Columbia, Waldseemüller feminized Americo's first name and made it America. And that's where the word America came from.